Ponto, eu acho que você está mudo.
Puxa, obrigado. Very sorry. I was on mute. One of those accidents that the new age of COVID has brought us. My apologies. We are talking from Getúlio Vargas Foundation from Brasilia, Brazil, at the School of Public Policy and Government. Today, we have the honor to have Professor Helen Margetts from the University of Oxford talking to us on a very important theme of artificial intelligence and public policies. With the pandemic, we have all experienced the importance and impact that internet has brought to us, many opportunities, and the power of artificial intelligence in this new environment. So I'm not going to waste too much time because we want to take all the advantage to learn from Professor Margetts. And I will let Professor Fernando Filgueiras do the introduction. But before I go, I would like to thank you, Professor Helen Margetts, for the opportunity. And we are hoping that soon we can welcome you in person and strengthen our relations with you and the University of Oxford. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity to us. And then I pass on to Fernando Filgueiras. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kondo. Good morning, everyone. Today, we will discuss in the series of the webinars on public policies of the School of Public Policy and Government, the role of artificial intelligence in public policies. For that, today, we will have the conference of Professor Helen Margetts. I take this opportunity to say that the public can get to know FGV's School of Public Policy and Government individual description. Application is now open for the Master in Public Policy and Government. The access link is available in the description. We will start this transmission by introducing Professor Helen Margetts. Professor Helen Margetts is Professor of Society and the Internet and Professional Fellow at Mansfield College, Oxford University. She is a political scientist specializing in the relationship between digital technology and government politics and public policy. Since 2018, Helen has been director of the Public Policy Program at the Alan Turing Institute, the United Kingdom's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Before starting our webinar, I need to make a disclaimer. I do the disclaimer in Portuguese and in English. In English, all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcast exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We will also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in the broadcast, which will be posted later on the FGV's official channels. Em português, as manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online representam exclusivamente as opiniões dos seus autores e não necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes concordaram em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e, com isso, autorizam o uso de sua imagem para essa transmissão, que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. Professor Margetts, it is a great pleasure to welcome you, and without further delay, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's very good to be here, although of course I wish I was there instead of here, which is my small office in Oxford. So are you going to share the presentation?
Please.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Great. Yes, so I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence and how it might be used for policy making, delivering public services, and basically for improving government. That's the hope. I'm doing that from a perspective, as you said, of having looked at the relationship between technology and government for a long time. And also in the program, through the program that I direct at the Alan Turing Institute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what artificial intelligence is. I expect you all know that, but just a recap of different perspectives of artificial intelligence. Then I'll introduce the Turing Institute Public Policy Program, and then I'll delve deeper into the kind of basic things that technology might do for government based on examples from the program, because we've got quite a lot of examples already. Next slide, please. So, and you can click through for the whole of the slide. So first of all, I mean, this is a kind of very usual perception of artificial intelligence, that it's some kind of magic. It's about robots that become so human that we can't distinguish them from human, that perhaps they become more intelligent than human and they start kind of overseeing all of us. But basically, some kind of magic. And if you do Google artificial intelligence, one thing you notice is that it appears to be blue. Most images of artificial intelligence tend to be blue. I don't know why, but that's the case. And some of them are a little bit crazy. The idea of, in the top left, for example, that we need robots to do typing on computers for us is a little bit odd. You know, why does the robot need the keyboard? There's lots of contradictions in the popular view of artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. In reality, artificial intelligence is not so glamorous. Here are a few images of the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute in the UK for artificial intelligence. And you can see there are quite boring things like desks, computers. There's even a blackboard in the top right image. It's got a physical location in a building in the British Library, although it's closed at the moment, like so many things in the UK. And there's the entrance, the Alan Turing Institute. Artificial intelligence is really a sort of intersection of mathematics, statistics, engineering, computer science. I would argue that you need some social science there too, and I'll say more about that later. But not so glamorous. And in fact, the director of the Alan Turing Institute, Adrian Smith, quite often says, well, of course, one day we'll go back to just calling it statistics. Next slide, please. So what is it really? Let's narrow down on what the sort of technology is. Well, ever since the 1950s, when Alan Turing himself created the Turing test to kind of assess the intelligence of a machine as being sort of indistinguishable from that of a human, we've considered really artificial intelligence about kind of building human intelligence. Can you click the next box? Thanks. And so perhaps the best summary is it's kind of a computer technology or a statistical method that thinks in a human type way, taking information from surroundings and responding on the basis of what it learns or senses. And the important point to note is that's different from kind of traditional information technology, the kind of technology that's been used in government since the 1950s in some countries, because it's not based on kind of rules and rules, basically. It's not based on sort of if this, then do that. It's based on the actual data in the real world that it can detect, patterns in and actually learn from, like we do as humans. And that's the important distinction, and I'll say more about that. Next slide, please. Okay, so another thing to point out is there's nothing new about artificial intelligence. In fact, it's been around since the 1950s, and particularly in the field of robotics. But what's different now are some important things. That is, we have much greater computing power than we had when artificial intelligence first kicked off. We have better algorithms. There have been many decades of development since the 1950s. The key point, though, perhaps, is that we have more data. Why? Because all of us, everywhere we go, all of us here at in this minute are generating all sorts of digital data about how we behave, what we've done, all the time. I mean, I could show you at this point, example, screen of my phone with, I'm sure you've all got something like this, hundreds of applications which link to data-driven platforms, basically AI-driven platforms, which are based on the kind of data that we generate by all the interactions and transactions we do. So there's so much more data now, and that's the key turning point, the so-called big data or data science kind of revolution. And that's what's also led to much greater investment in artificial intelligence and much more research and development, because there are real possibilities of doing real things that we really need. Next slide, please. But I should point out here that in general, as with earlier technological innovations, governments tend to lag behind the private sector in developing artificial intelligence, kind of making the most of it. Here are three examples of, can you click the next box? The three examples of kind of huge policy initiatives. Obamacare in the US, or Affordable Healthcare Act, the Universal Credit in the UK, which is the biggest reform to the welfare system since the 1940s, and My Health Record in Australia. All those three flagship policy programs kind of ran the risk of just not working because of the technology, because of the kind of, in the healthcare example, because of the website crashed on the first day it was put up. Universal Credit, the earlier version of the computer system to administer universal credit, around £800 million were wasted on that through the development of a failed system. And My Health Record, huge percentages of Australians refused to opt into that system because they basically didn't trust what was going to be done with their data. So despite a lot of interest in technology, governments around the world have a history of struggling with technological innovation, and we should remember that when we talk about the latest innovation, artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. They'll struggle with data science and AI for the same reasons they struggled with earlier digital systems. And I'm sure, I mean, if you have experience of digital government in Brazil, then that will be different to my experience in the UK or the US and so on. And every country has its own experience. But in general, this is a generalization, governments have struggled for these reasons. One is building up in-house expertise and capacity. In general, governments are kind of bureaucracy is what they're supposed to be good at. Their core competency is not large-scale technology projects. Difficult for governments to pay the same sort of salaries that people are getting in the private sector. Next box. Difficulties, therefore, in evaluating work, even if it's contracted out to private providers, can still be very difficult to evaluate it. And there's a lot of cultural barriers to using technology, particularly with government agencies that have had big problems in the past. This is particularly true in the UK. We have a long history of very large scale and expensive information technology disasters. And that shaped the way that officials approach technology now, makes it a more sort of disturbing idea. Next slide, please. So I think as sort of independent academic researchers, we at the Turing Institute, for example, at my own institute, the Oxford Internet Institute, I'm sure at FGV as well, and Stanford, the new human-centered artificial intelligence center. Can you click the next box, please? You know, we're all thinking about this, and I kind of think we have a duty to think about this and try and shape the AI revolution, as it's often called, for the public good. The Stanford Center is another example of a sort of relatively new center that is focusing on this area. Next slide, please. Okay, so quick introduction to the Alan Turing Institute program. The Turing is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. It's a partnership of 13 universities, which is shown there, all over the UK and Scotland included. And yeah, we were set up as the National Institute in 2015-16. And that gives us a lot of access to expertise from all those universities, which is exciting. Next slide, please. But the bit of the Alan Turing Institute is a big operation. There's probably over 400 university researchers directly working on Turing Institute projects. But I want to talk about this one because this is the part of the Turing Institute that I set up and now direct, which is the Public Policy Research Programme, or the Public Policy Programme. And I wanted to set up this programme because I've worked for so long on the relationship between government and technology. I've seen all the problems, all the struggles that government has had with technology, and I wanted to help government have a better time with the latest generation of technology than it has had perhaps with earlier generations. So that was the idea. We launched in 2018. Next slide, please. And we went all over government, kind of talking to people and asking them kind of what problems they had, what problems that might be solved by this latest generation of technology. And we came up with these 4 overarching aims. We found that around half of the things that policymakers were interested in was developing technological capacity, overcoming some of those technical barriers. And then the other half were the kind of ethical challenges, the moral challenges of using this technology to make public policy. It was around about half and half, and that gave us 2 sets of kind of aims and objectives. On the one hand, use this technology to make policy making and service delivery better. And on the other side, the red side, develop a sort of framework, build the ethical foundations for doing that safely and ethically. And also, of course, the whole area of regulation of AI, that's critical. Next slide, please. So our job is to link the government to the Institute's community of, well, over 500, I said 400, but now it's 500, AI researchers. We've worked with, or we've interacted with at least 70 public sector organisations, but we work particularly closely with government departments and regulators. We've particularly been working with regulators on the idea of sort of building capacity in this area, because that's absolutely crucial for regulation in the future. Every market, every section of society that is kind of governed has changed through the use of data-driven platforms. That's an important point to think about. Next slide, please. So we've got around about 30 research projects, about 70 researchers involving 10 universities. Next slide, please. And one thing that was quite useful to us at the beginning in 2018, we were invited, our launch was announced and everything, and we were invited by the journal Nature to write a comment piece on what government might look like with artificial intelligence. And if anyone wants to kind of think more about any of the things I talk about, please do take a look at that. It's only short. But it was really useful to us, actually, to kind of distill that down into what this technology could actually do for government. It forced us to think about that. And next slide, please. And there are the 5 kind of things that government needs to do, or didn't used to do but could do, or used to do but used to do quite badly, how those things might be better. So there they are, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Simulation and evaluation, being able to try things out without getting any unintended consequences before actually implementing policy. Measurement and detection, measuring what's going on in society, criminal behavior, for example, being able to detect it first and measure it second. Prediction and forecasting, thinking about the future, that's not something that government has traditionally been very good at. Personalization, being able to personalize services to individual people, for example, that's something that could be really useful to government. And finally, this ethical framework and governance framework, that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. This data, this technology driven by data quite often forces us to think about some normative issues, moral, ethical issues that we perhaps should have been thinking about before, but the technology sort of forces us to think about them. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's delve more deeply into those things now. And I'm going to use examples from the Turing Institute and talk a little bit more about the technology. So next slide, please. So first, we're talking about simulation. And the key technology here is agent computing. And any agent computing experts in the audience, please forgive me while I just give a sort of very first steps guide to what is agent computing. So agent computing is a good way to allow us to use data to model complex, interdependent systems. So a good example of a complex interdependent system is an ant's nest. And the traditional way that technology, sort of non-data driven technology, would allow us to model an ant's nest would be to think about all the rules that apply to ants, you know, how much weight they can carry, for example, and where they tend to go. And that would be how we would try to understand what was going on in the ant's nest. But say we had data, say the ants were generating data wherever they went. We might be able to take all that data about how ants behave, generated by the ants, and then model the ant's nest. Okay, so that's how it works with ants, but how would it work for public policy? Why would that be useful? Can you click through? In a policy context, it sort of allows us or gives us the ability to understand a complex system kind of better than we have before in a different way. And of course, agent computing is another part of artificial intelligence, or another sort of branch of artificial intelligence that's been around a long time, but was not much kind of used to policy in the past because it had so little data. There were only toy models, really. You need an awful lot of data to be able to have a good agent-based model. But these days, we have started to have that sort of data. So think of modeling traffic. The old way would be to think of some formula of population and roads and economy and everything. But now there's the possibility to model each vehicle, which is generating data all the time through satellite navigation systems and so on, to model roads which have got sensors all the way along them. And we know that from things like Waze or any satellite navigation system, allows us to have a sort of see data on all those things. So now we could model traffic in a different way. Same applies to military operations. The old way would be kind of some kind of formula of casualties based on rules of engagement and that kind of thing. Can you click through? And now we can do it on actual data relating to soldiers, weapons and bullets. And of course, the more we have the Internet of Things, the more that's going to happen. And then, of course, the financial market and macroeconomic models. We're getting to the point where we can move beyond having some sort of representative agent model with aggregate data to micro data on consumers and firms. Next slide, please. And in fact, some people, for example, the economist Robin Axtell, has started to create digital replicas of our economies that we can run experiments on without hurting anyone. Think that would be like, for example, economic policy making coming out of the current pandemic. You can click through. If you had data about kind of millions and millions of workers and firms and job changes and everything, you could actually try out a policy without causing damage. And that would be a very useful thing to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so how are we using that? Well, one project we have is working with the UN to help developing countries think about their sustainable development goals. Where should they prioritize resources, policy resources? Should they put money into health or education or transport? What would be the optimization of resources that would help them meet sustainable development goals? Could you click through, please? We're using an agent computing approach. We're capturing all the dependencies between policy areas. You can click through. Yeah, maybe a bit quicker. Sorry about this. We had a slide sharing problem. Thank you. You get the picture. It's a very complex system. You know, if you have a problem with education, that affects the economy. If you have a problem with health, that affects education, and so on. All policy areas are very interconnected. Next slide, please. Another project that we have is using agent computing to understand the implications of varying levels of police resourcing. To be able to try having less police in a certain locality without actually doing it and suffering the consequences. So it can vary the level in the model of different levels of policing, different numbers of police and so on, and see what the effect that might have. And if we can get a really good agent-based model to do that, we could start thinking about the number of teachers we have or the number of nurses and so on. Policymakers are quite excited about that. Next slide, please. Okay, so for these three in the middle, measurement and detection, prediction and forecasting, personalization, the key technology here is machine learning, which is really the kind of workhorse technology of artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar with machine learning, a very quick introduction, okay? So we know that we want to be able to say, without knowing anything about dogs, that these two creatures are dogs. What do we need to do that in a machine learning world? I mean, before machine learning, we would, I mean, if a computer was doing it, you would have to tell it all the characteristics of a dog in advance before it could work out if something was a dog. But as humans, we don't learn like that, do we? I mean, as a child, we see lots of different sorts of dogs, and we learn to work out what is a dog. And that's what a machine learning algorithm is trying to do, to learn in that sort of way. You need an algorithm that actually sends the machine learning technology off to kind of look at lots of dogs and work out what is a dog and classify the whatever it's seeing as dogs or not dogs. You need a large quantity of data. You can't do this with small quantities of data because machine learning algorithms just can't learn on small quantities of data. You need good data. you don't want lots of cows in it, because then the algorithm won't produce a very good way of classifying dogs. And you need good variation of data, because if you've only got dogs like that first dog, which is a pretty normal bog standard sort of terrier type dog, then your algorithm is not going to be able to work out that the crazy creature on the right is actually a dog. But I'm sure everyone here can very quickly do that. So it's a question of having enough data, enough variation, good quality enough data for the algorithm to be able to learn that. Next slide, please. Well, that's a very bad joke, but it does help you understand and remember what machine learning is. So a machine learning algorithm walks into a bar. The bartender says, "What are you going to have?" And the algorithm says, "What's everyone else having?" And that is a key thing to remember about machine learning. That's how it's learning. It's learning from what everyone else is having. It doesn't have its own preferences or its rules. We all have little rules about deciding what drink we're going to have. I don't know, whether it's alcoholic and so on. It doesn't have those kind of rules. Okay, if you pass on. Okay, yeah, you can pass on. Click through, yeah. Okay, so measurement and detection. How can we detect what's going on and how can we measure it? So a project we have there is on hate speech. If you click through to that. Okay, so that's a project which I'm particularly keen on because I'm the principal investigator on that project. And we're developing new ways of using machine learning to detect hate speech. For example, there's all sorts of different types of hate speech like misogyny and racism and so on. But how do you detect it when you've got a large body of social media data? It's a really serious problem. In the UK, for example, there's so much misogyny in online settings that we can imagine whole generations of women not really engaging with the political process. So that's important. And we have to know about it in order to do something about it, in order to design countermeasures. And that project is working on that issue as well. How can we intervene to stop hate speech online? It's a particular problem after the pandemic when we're all spending so much more time online. Click through, please. Okay, and one thing I would point out about that project, that's a real marriage of machine learning and social science. It's developing cutting-edge machine learning classifiers, but it's using social science to tackle some of the normative questions there about what is hate and what is kind of hate that we should allow and disallow. Those are really normative questions, and they're sort of social science type questions. They're classification and definitional questions. And I don't see how that research could take place in anything other than a multidisciplinary way. Next slide, please. Prediction and forecasting. That's a key thing that we know that machine learning can do. The project here is a project on air quality. So the Turing has a project on air quality where we're developing machine learning algorithms. The problem with air quality, understanding air quality, is that you can't have sensors absolutely everywhere, or perhaps you can, but we haven't. So you want to be able to measure air quality where you aren't, where you haven't got sensors, and you want to be able to predict trends and where it's going in the future. And that's what this project is about, how to predict air quality in places where you are not. Do you want to click through? And that's what that project's doing. That's a very valuable thing to be able to do. We can't tackle air quality unless we know where it's at its worst and where it's kind of better and where we need to intervene and where and what's going to happen in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so personalization, I mentioned that quickly because it's not something that's really, it's talked about in government in some countries, but it's not really happening. So personalization would be taking this prediction thing and really personalizing it to me. So for example, there's me, well, it's not me, but I mean, it could be me, I've got a dog, and I might go onto Amazon quite often to buy dog food. And at some point, and Amazon is using this method, has moved beyond just sort of when I order some dog food, getting it into the warehouse. Amazon is moving towards the point where it's doing predictive shipping. It's anticipating my needs. It's saying, well, she always orders dog food every 6 weeks. So let's get it into the warehouse and then we'll send it out when she needed it. You can click through. There you are. Happy me, happy dog. Okay, next slide, please. And Netflix does this all the time, for example. So there are some images you get when you're choosing your movie. You may not realize this, but each of those is personalized to you based on you and your previous behavior. So I might see a different image from Fernando because we like different sorts of movies. We bought different ones in the past. And Netflix has gone to a huge amount of computational effort to personalize that little screen that you see. Next slide, please. Now, when that happens in government, and this is leading me to my last box of the blue boxes, that's a much more controversial issue. It doesn't really matter what screen you see when you're watching Netflix. It's a very sort of low risk thing to do, if you like. But here's a much more controversial thing to do. Quite a lot of local authorities in the UK are using machine learning to identify children at risk. Children who are at risk of some kind of danger from the family that they're living in, maybe a risk of abuse or something that will lead to them being taken away from home and placed in some kind of institutionalized care. Now, local authorities need to know aggregate demand for care places, so they want to be able to do that. And doing it at the aggregate level is fine, predicting kind of what the demand is going to be next year. But what happens when you tell a local authority or a policymaker that, you're going to need 5,000 childcare places next year or whatever? They're immediately going to say, yes, but which ones, which children, because then they might be able to intervene and stop the bad thing happening. And then that's a very difficult area. Who's got the right to that information? Should you tell them? What if it's a probability of 0.95? You kind of think, well, I should tell them. But then you're telling them to sort of intervene, even though it's not definite that it could happen. What if it's a probability of 0.6? What does that even mean? Very difficult questions. You can click through. Can we explain the outcomes? I mean, if we can't explain the outcomes, then how can we justify to parents saying we're going to take your child away because our computer told us to? It's morally, that's very difficult. Click through. Are the outcomes biased anyway? Is it more likely telling people from certain areas or certain ethnic groups or certain religions? This is a common problem with machine learning algorithms. They're based on current data. And if that data is biased, and it might be data from the current system, and we've always been, treating children from different racial groups differently in the care system, that will have generated data, and that will make the machine learning algorithm biased. Again, if that's the case, that makes you even more worried about using it to make this kind of decision. And should we be even right? If we're not going to use it, should we even be writing these algorithms in the first place? Very difficult questions. I'm not going to go into that because I want to leave some time for discussion. But if you click through to the next slide, can you click through? Yeah, great. There's a very detailed review of the question of using machine learning in children's social care there, written by my team. I really recommend, if you're interested in these issues, having a look at that, and note that it ends up with a very cautious note. Unless you can take this very thoughtful and inclusive approach, don't do it. Next slide, please. So that comes to my sort of final key point here about ethics and governance. You have to consider these issues. You have to have some framework that forces you to consider these issues. Otherwise, you're just going to reinforce and make worse any existing biases in the system. Here we have an example of Amazon, who were working on an AI recruiting tool for years and years. They've just scrapped it, or last year or so they scrapped it because it was biased against women. Why was it biased against women? Because Amazon's hiring processes had always been biased against women. It was using lots of data from their existing hiring system and leading them to become even more biased. But it's also doing something else. The same thing has happened with mortgage algorithms, which perpetuate racial bias. People were being treated in a racist way when they were applying for mortgages. That system from the past was used to predict the future in a machine learning algorithm, and they were being presented as higher risk. Next slide, please. So that's where the technology kind of lays bare bias in the system, and you need to have some framework to deal with that. We produced, and do have a look at that if you're interested, we produce for the UK government the kind of official guide for the an ethical framework for ethics and safety of AI in the public sector. And we're quite proud of that. I don't think there is one anywhere else in the world, and it is used widely across the public sector. We feel it sort of offers the opportunity to use these technologies in a safe way. As long as you're thinking about them and working out how to mitigate things like bias and to make things more transparent and to make things fairer and more accountable, that's crucial. Who's accountable if something goes wrong, then you can proceed. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the point I've been making. The point about that guide is it's based on values. It's based on normative principles, philosophical principles. The senior ethics fellow on my team who wrote that guide, he is a philosopher, in fact. And it should inform regulation. I said at the beginning, we're working with lots of regulators, and it informs that regulatory framework. Next slide, please. Those issues are going to be absolutely crucial for AI innovation in the future. Think about the issue of accountability, for example, which I just mentioned. Who's accountable if that robot drops that patient in a hospital? Who's accountable? Here's a driverless car, a self-driving car. Who's accountable if that car crashes? You've got to work out those regulatory mechanisms. Otherwise, I would contend you shouldn't be using the car or the robot. Next slide, please. And that's the last one. Oh, actually, it's not the last one. Yeah. Just to make a point, I haven't talked about the pandemic. We're doing a lot of research now, a sort of post-pandemic research. So just to mention that quickly, all these things that I've been talking about can really be valuable in a pandemic. And you could argue that countries will be distinguished in the future by their ability to do these things. If you just click through the things here. Okay, so there you are, simulation. Why can't we simulate lockdown measures? I don't believe you have so many lockdown measures in Brazil, but as in the UK, but at the moment we're completely locked down. I can't go into my office, I can't go to a shop and so on. But what's the effect of that on the economy? We need to be able to simulate that. It would be so good if we could simulate that before we do it to understand the effects. We need to detect health-related misinformation. There's a lot of really pernicious misinformation about cures and treatments for COVID-19, for example. How can we detect it, measure it, and then how can we intervene? How can we predict where the next outbreak's going to be? We all want to do that, of course, because then we have a chance of stopping it. How can we personalize people's treatment plans from the data that the disease is already generating? And finally, how can we understand how to govern the technologies? How can we govern the technologies like contact tracing apps and so on, so that people will trust them and use them? Because if they don't use them, they won't be any use. Okay, sorry, and the last slide is really the last slide. Don't take data science ethics out of a crisis. Those are going to be really crucial to successful interventions. And there's an important article there in the Harvard Data Science Review by my colleague David Leslie. And looking at the time, I think I'd like to stop there so that we've got a little bit of time for discussion. So thank you for listening.
Okay, Professor Margetts, thank you. Yes, we are in the discussion and we have questions about the AI public policies. We have a question by Michelle Fernandez. In the context of morality, is artificial intelligence something positive or negative?
I mean,
yeah.
I think that's like asking, is a nuclear power station, well, no, it's not quite like asking that. I mean, it depends how you use it, that's the point. I think the key point is about the ethical framework. There's a lot of talk about AI ethics at the moment. You know, almost every international organization in the world has got some sort of partnership on AI or some sort of global initiative to understand the ethics of AI. But that's one thing. But you really need a usable framework so that you can use it in a way that isn't going to kind of, that is going to sort of tackle the normative issues I was talking about. You have to somehow ensure fairness. So you have to work against bias on the basis of gender or race and so on. It has to be accountable. You can't, there's a lot of talk about sort of, and a tendency among policymakers to sort of blame algorithms for things. And I'm very much against that view. We've actually here had our own Prime Minister blaming on, so we had a policy disaster in the summer where our exam results were calculated by an algorithm, and the results were disastrous because they ignored the performance of individual pupils. They just generalized on the basis of the school. Now, that's because the statistical process that was used to calculate the results did exactly what the policymakers had asked it to do. They were accountable for the problem. The statistics can't be a statistical process, a kind of machine learning algorithm can't be accountable because it's got no agency. But what we had was policymakers, in fact, the Prime Minister himself referred to a mutant algorithm. And that's a very dangerous view. So accountability is really key here. You have to think about who's accountable. There's always someone involved, someone or some organization, and you have to build in accountability mechanisms.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We have a question by Mateo Torres. Mentoring bias in sensitive topics such as racism can be tricky. Which metrics are often used for this purpose? To propose the metrics to propose mentoring racism, for example.
Sorry, I can't hear you really well.
Okay. Measuring bias in sensitive topics such as racism can be tricky. Which metrics are often used for this purpose?
Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you really well. I mean, I think it's something about the methods for treating fairness. Was that right?
Yes.
Well, one thing is the kind of sunlight of transparency, because you need some kind of measurement of. It should be kind of beholden on people who produce these algorithms to be able to show that it's not biased. And we've got to move beyond the idea that you can sort of take somebody's word for it. And I think there is a tendency to do that. The dominant kind of culture or way of dealing with these ethical issues in the past has been, it's called responsible research innovation, which is a good thing, but it is a tendency for it to mean, trust me, I'm a scientist, or trust me, I'm a technologist. So I think it should be beholden on the producers of algorithms to show that they're not biased, to go through a number of sort of processes to illustrate that they're not biased. There are technical means to kind of to force algorithms not to be biased, but you need to be able to sort of reveal the bias before you can do that. So transparency is the key. You've got to transparency and accountability. You've got to be able to hold them to account.
Okay, Professor. Professor, another question. Many countries are implementing national strategies for the development of AI. One of the biggest challenges is the problem of data protection. There is an emerging conception of data nationalism, for example. To what extent it can hinder the adoption of AI technologies in public sector and global perspective on the digital world?
Again, I had some problem hearing you, but I think it was about data protection.
Yes. National strategies for artificial intelligence have a big challenge, that is data protection. Data nationalism, for example, is a result of this perspective of the data protection. How data protection or data nationalism impacts the AI technologies in public sector and the global perspective of the digital world?
Well, it's very important, clearly. Theoretically, the whole concept of big data should be that there's so much data that it's kind of anonymous. And in general, these technologies are trying to do something that kind of works with data en masse rather than individual level data. But clearly that's not enough. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which data can kind of reveal or de-anonymize individuals. And I think, regulation, I think, is the answer. In this country, we at the moment are bound by the European General Data Protection Regulation. And that's quite an interesting example of where regulation, it was furiously resisted by the big giants of Silicon Valley. It was like, oh, the sky's going to fall in, you can't do that, it will destroy everything. But it didn't, and the sky didn't fall in. And basically, I believe it had a beneficial effect. We're facing the issue that we're leaving the European Union, and what will happen to things like GDPR, and I would be an advocate of it remaining there. I think you have to regulate, but it also, of course, has to be part of any ethical framework. I would say, though, that there is a tendency, particularly among the engineering community and computer science community, to think that it's the only thing. We were involved in a health analytics project during the beginning of the pandemic, which was to use real-time health analytics data to sort of work out treatment plans and allocate things like scarce resources like ventilators. And then if you're doing that kind of thing, you get into the very difficult moral issues that I was mentioning. You know, how do you decide who gets a ventilator and who doesn't, if the person who doesn't get the ventilator is going to be much more seriously ill or possibly even die? You know, these are huge questions. And they're moral questions, and they go beyond data protection. But what we found when we started working on that project was that, you know, all the discussion was about GDPR and data protection. Kind of, as long as we've got that right, everything else is okay. So it's a very important feature of an ethical framework, but it mustn't become the primary focus, because it can take you away from these other kind of moral issues, which are kind of new.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Another question. One of the major issues related to development of AI is the issue of data governance. How do you perceive the role of governments in the issue of data governance?
Well, I mean, it's really important. I mean, in the same way that data protection is really important. I mean, the point is that when you put different data sources together, that is going to kind of potentially challenge some of the ethical principles that I've been talking about. So, I don't know, take fairness, for example. You could be working with data from the social services, social care system, or the healthcare system or something. But if you were to put data together from the criminal justice system, most people accept that most criminal justice systems tend to be biased. They tend to be racist, because, you know, there's been a lot of racism in policing and criminal justice generally in a lot of countries. Even if we're not specific here, I think everyone would understand that. And some people would argue that as soon as you've got data from the criminal justice system, it has a much higher chance of being biased, and it introduces bias into your kind of algorithm that you're using. So you really need to think about things like that, you know, where the data comes from. Also, you get very controversial uses of data when you start putting data sources together. For example, we've had examples in this country of the Home Office, you know, the kind of immigration department, using data from the health service. Is that ethical? A lot of people would say no, it's not. But it's a very controversial area, and so you do need kind of checks and balances and principles that are going to allow you to say, oh, well, actually, you shouldn't do that. And some of the examples I pointed at the beginning, that example of my healthcare record in Australia, or actually the earlier case of electronic health records in the UK, was precisely this issue. Is an ethical issue that comes from not paying enough attention to data governance issues. And what you get then is, if people don't know what's happening to their data, then they don't want to share their data. They maybe withdraw their data. They don't trust an application. Have the same in many countries with contact tracing applications. They don't share their data, and that means that the applications don't work very well. The machine learning algorithms won't work very well if large numbers of people have actually opted out of the system. So they're all interlinked, and often we find this when we're involved in collaborative projects, that when we start talking about ethics, you know, we may get some of the technologists saying, oh, there they go, banging on about ethics again. But the point we may be making is that it won't work. One of our ethical principles is actually sustainability. I don't mean sustainability in the kind of environmental sense. I mean in the trust sense. Something's not sustainable, an algorithm's not sustainable if there's no trust. And many countries have seen that in the pandemic, of people just not trusting kind of the testing and tracing system, for example, or something like that, and then they don't provide their data.
Professor Margetts, we have a last question. do you think AI machines would pass the Turing test anything in the near future?
Sorry, is it going to be?
Yes. Do you think AI machines would pass the Turing test anytime in the near future? Yeah. This is our last question.
Yeah. I'll end on a more sort of speculative note then. Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. I mean, there are bots that people think are humans and they turn out to be bots and so on. But I'd say that it's not the most important question. We've got a big program of work starting at the Turing Institute called Shocks and Resilience, where we're trying to build the kind of data science and AI models that we believe are what we needed in this pandemic, and or what we will need in the future when we face kind of major shocks and crises. And our argument is this, that the emphasis on technology, on the development of AI and earlier technologies has always been sort of replacing humans, doing things which humans can already do. That's what the Turing test tests. It tests the technology kind of exactly like a human. And so we build robots that can do things that humans can already do. The big test of a robot: can it walk without falling over? Can it drive a car? Can it play chess or a Go or another board game? But we can already do those things. What you could argue, why is the emphasis always on things we can already do? Wouldn't it be more useful if robots could do things that we're rubbish at? And one of the things we're rubbish at is building models that integrate sort of lots of different sources of data and put them together to help us make decisions. We just can't do that as humans. We just don't think like that. We can't process it. We're not sort of powerful enough cognitively and so on. So we're trying to build some basically AI models that could do that, could perhaps build a model that would sort of really confront the interdependencies between the economic system and the health system and the education system. So I think it's not a question of whether you can pass the Turing test, it's whether we should rethink the way that we test technology.
Okay, Professor. We have many other questions, but unfortunately we have to finish. Once again, I would like to thank you, Professor Margetts. I believe that artificial intelligence is a big challenge for governments. I thank the audience, and I wish everyone a good day. Thanks so much, Professor Helen Margetts. We finished this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.